The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 20 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Have you ever wondered about how early American men, women, and slaves worshipped? Religion played a large role in why some Europeans decided to immigrate to British North America. The Puritans of New England, German Protestants of the Mid-Atlantic region, and the Catholics of Maryland all migrated to North America to worship freely. And that's to name but a few of the groups that came. Today, Kyle T. Bultice, an assistant professor of history at Utah State University and author of Four Steeples Over the City Streets, Religion and Society in New York's Early Republic Congregations, joins us to explore early American religious life. Kyle will reveal what the religious landscape of colonial North America and the early Republic United States looked like, how the Anglican and Methodist churches of New York City weathered the American Revolution and thrived after it, and what the religious experiences of colonial and early Republic New York City can tell us about the wider religious history of the United States during the early Republic period. But first, would you like to know how you can ask a future guest historian a question? Stay tuned, because after our conversation with Kyle, I will reveal how you can pose your questions. Okay, let's travel back in time to revolutionary and early Republic New York City with our guide, Kyle Bultice.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Today we welcome Kyle T. Bultice, an assistant professor at Utah State University. His research focuses on 19th century United States history and early American religious history. Kyle is the author of Four Steeples Over the City Streets, Religion and Society in New York's Early Republic Congregations. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Kyle.
Thank you, Liz. I'm glad to be here.
And we're pleased to have you because you're going to take us through part of the religious history of early Republic, New York City. And I wonder, just before we get into our discussion about that topic, if you would tell us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in early American religious history specifically.
Well, when I was in graduate school, I found myself really attracted to the readings in early America generally, in part because I think the story of early American history is just markedly different from the larger narrative, in part because a good chunk of that time is taken up by an era in which there is no United States, there is no nation state. So early American history is often dominated by issues that we might see in world history or in borderlands history, competing empires, differing nation groups that don't have states, movements of peoples that in many ways is a more complicated, messier story than sometimes we have heard in the U.S. history survey. And so that's what brought me to early America. And in the early American world, religion is interwoven throughout the narrative. I've always been interested in American religion and its various forms, and it seemed like a good place to go.
Could you provide us with a brief overview of the types of religions that early Americans practiced, and whether perhaps maybe those religions were more popular in some regions than others?
Sure, yeah. The colonial the North American British colonies were, from the start, much more religiously pluralistic than anywhere in Europe. At least most observers noted that as such. That is, there was a greater variety of differing religious groups in any given location than elsewhere. That said, for most of the colonial period, early American religion was largely Protestant, and in most places was largely Calvinist theologically. And so this pluralism was, in some cases, a situation of groups that were like cousins, maybe squabbling over points that might seem very narrow today. By far the most diverse, the most pluralistic of the colonies were the middle colonies. That's New York and Pennsylvania particularly. They had the widest range of groups within them, the most religious diversity. And throughout early America, you do have significant Jewish populations in places like New York or Charleston. You do have Roman Catholic populations in various places like New York or Philadelphia or Maryland. Of course, there's a large Quaker presence in Pennsylvania. Even in New England, where we say the story is about the Puritans and later Congregationalists, there are divisions within them. So there are varieties of Baptists and Presbyterians that are contending. So in none of these places is religion a uniform thing. In all of them is it a place where people are encountering others with different beliefs and in many cases no belief at all.
And there was a big Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, too, right? That's not something we normally associate with New England.
That's correct, yeah. The Newport, New York, Charleston are the three largest centers of Jewish population.
So you mentioned that New York was one of the most religiously plural colonies, but you focused specifically on 4 congregations in New York City between the late 18th and mid-19th centuries. And those 4 congregations include 2 Episcopal and 2 Methodist churches. So how did you, with all this variety, how did you choose to study specifically Anglican and Methodist churches in New York City, instead of maybe like the Lutheran or the Dutch Reformed or, the Jewish congregations there?
As you know, Bulthuis is a Dutch surname, and I actually have one of my cousins ask me why I didn't do the Dutch Reformed, because that is a part of my family's heritage. And the short answer is that the Anglican Episcopalian tradition from the colonial period was connected very much to the British imperial mission. That is, the Anglican Church had an aim of missionizing and uniting what were a series of diverse colonies. The goal of Anglicanism in the New World was to bring all people who resided within the British Empire under the Anglican Church religiously. And so part of my story is examining that narrative strain, that attempt to homogenize, that attempt to make sense of that attempt to order what was a very messy, very complicated religious landscape. The Methodists are a counterpoint to that because they come out of Anglicanism. Methodists were members of the Church of England until shortly after the American Revolution, and they were sort of a missionary wing that was more boisterous, more turbulent, more excitable. And so by looking at Anglicans, Episcopalians, and then on one hand and Methodists on the other, I was able to look at, in some ways, American history, religious history writ large, by looking at a couple of smaller examples. That is, we could look at some of the larger strains, attempts to create order, attempts to unite people, and at the same time splintering emotional revivalism, enthusiasm, all of which are sort of a continual push and pull in American religious history.
So is the boisterism and the missionary efforts of the Methodists, is that what separates them from the Anglicans, or are there other differences between the two faiths?
Well, initially, no. And typically, American historians have highlighted the egalitarian, enthusiastic characteristics of Methodism. What I found in my study was that because Methodism in New York was a fairly early implant, and because also it was in a city environment, Methodism in New York had an element that was more restrained, more formal, more literate than perhaps some of its frontier cousins that many historians have examined. The primary distinction between Methodists and Anglicans was, though, that element of an emphasis on a personal, heartfelt conversion. Methodists were in what we would call evangelical. That is, they insisted on a personal religious transformation of the believer's heart, whereas Anglican Episcopalians would typically not find that necessary. One could grow up in the church, be sheltered by the sacraments, and any sort of conversion could be very gradual and lifelong.
So one of the Anglican Episcopal congregations that Kyle studies in Four Steeples Over the City Streets is Trinity Church, which he calls an establishment church. Kyle, what is an establishment church, and what powers or privileges would an establishment church like Trinity have, say, over any of the other churches in the New York City community?
Religious establishment had been a long-tested, long-used concept in European history, and the very process of transplanting establishment to the New World met with some difficulty. It was incomplete. Trinity was an established church in New York, but New York establishment was something that was not as powerful as it was, say, in London. In general, establishment basically refers to a church-state interrelationship whereby the church supports, defends, complements the government and the monarch, and in turn, the monarch and the government give their support of the church. And it's seen as a mutually reinforcing relationship because both parties are interested in morality, public morality, in order, in a population that's going to be obedient and willing to cooperate with established powers. Now, in the case of Trinity benefited in a couple ways from establishment. First, Trinity had been granted a large tract of land on the west side of Manhattan, which it used to support itself throughout the early Republic era, and I could even note to this day, Trinity Corporation is now essentially a real estate manager of parts of Lower Manhattan. So that land grant, that early privilege, was something that allowed it resources that other churches didn't have. Trinity also was in charge for a time of poor relief in the city and took that very seriously. And consequently, there was a sense of, we might say, universalizing aim or a sense of responsibility for the city at large that maybe other congregations might not have, because there was this insistence that as a privileged church, as an established church, its aim maybe went a little bit farther than the believers that were within the building itself. And so those sorts of things accompanied Trinity throughout its history, even after the Revolution, when legally, politically, establishment was ended. The impetus for watching over, keeping an eye on, attempting to shape the course of the city remained.
Now, to just jump forward a bit in time, the American Revolution was not kind to any Anglican establishments because so many patriots viewed the Anglican Church as a part of the British imperialism that they were fighting against. So that, I mean, to my knowledge, that's why the American Anglicans became Episcopalians after the Revolution, was not because they necessarily believed in different things from the English Anglican Church, but because the word Anglican was kind of almost like a dirty word.
Yeah,
would you talk to us about how Trinity Church and its Anglican congregation survive, and not just survive the American Revolution, but they prosper after it?
Well, initially, what happens is Trinity's patriot members temporarily take control of the church. In the 1780s, the New York City Council turns very radical. It turns against any sort of signs of loyalism. And for a while, it appears that Trinity might come under fire and lose all its property and maybe be dismantled. And consequently, some patriot but conservative-leaning Anglicans basically take over the church. They oust the proposed minister who is going to be coming in, who was a moderate loyalist, a man by the name of Benjamin Moore. And men with patriot credentials such as John Jay and Robert Livingston join the vestry, or the ruling body of Trinity Church, and shepherd the church for a few years. This is very temporary. After this time, the church reverts back to many former loyalists in charge. The patriots seem to be willing to do this because what the congregation is about is, in essence, social order, propriety, gentility, and whether they were patriot or loyalist, they were all friends of property, they were all friends of order, and were in general agreement on that. So after this temporary shakeup in the 1780s where patriots sort of took the public face of the church for a few years, former loyalists trickled back into positions of leadership, and the church resumed in a social way to attempt to continue establishment. That is, they didn't accept didn't attempt to create any sort of formal political or legal ties with the state, but that impetus to take a leading role in society remained. There was a sense that Trinity's members were social leaders, that the church itself was an important force in the city. And so that social impetus, that social drive remained well beyond the revolution.
It seems like social order would be a good thing to have after a revolution. So I can imagine why some of the patriots would want to latch onto another organization to try and reimpose order after such a long period of disorder.
Certainly, and most of Trinity's patriots are people that we would now call Federalists in that first era of party conflict. They would see George Washington as a friend of theirs. Washington, of course, being seen as very formal and somewhat hierarchical in his own leanings, having been a general. They typically allied with Alexander Hamilton in his economic policies. These were people who we might call conservative in a certain sense, and certainly saw a type of the revolution for them was one that did not upend society. A good revolution was one that was limited, that preserved property rights, that reinstated a proper sense of rule. And so yes, Trinity's patriots even were very much on that, in that camp or in that group.
Now, you mentioned that many in the Trinity Church congregation were friends of property, friends of social order, and Federalists. These are, in some ways, terms you think of with the wealthy class. Was Trinity a congregation of the wealthy, or did it have all sorts of congregants in its congregation?
Yeah, well, Trinity did have people from every social rank in it. It had enslaved members as well, which is part of my story. But the overwhelming leadership of the church is wealthy. In fact, one of the things that I looked at was the pew rents in Trinity Church. You go to a church today, and if you see pews or benches, think that's just a place for people to sit. But the late colonial model of pews was one in which each person rented their space. And the pews were more like boxes in which people sat along with their families. And in Trinity, the church was spatially organized so that the pews reflected the hierarchy of the church. So that at the front of the church and at the front of the balcony above the church stood the most expensive pews, where it might cost $15 or $20 per year for the families to reside there. As you went farther back, and so typically you might have prominent politicians, somebody like John Jay, who was governor for a time. You may have cabinet makers, certainly merchants, people like Philip Hone. later on George Templeton Strong. Men of wealth, their wives, their children, perhaps their slaves attending them. The farther back and more to the corners that one goes in the sanctuary, one finds people of more middling sort, grocers, tailors, shoemakers. And then farthest back on the margins would be the poor. There are a few seats reserved for those who can pay no pew rent. Slaves, if they're not attending families with their white families who own them, would be also in the back, or in the back of the balcony, or in the back of the sanctuary on the main floor as well. So Trinity reflects the range of social status from the richest to the poorest, including slaves. But you see very clearly in its makeup that the wealthy are at the front, they're at the top, they're the public face, and so Trinity in many ways reflects that sense of propriety.
So how did the Methodists fare during the American Revolution and just after it? And was the leadership of the Methodist congregations you study as well off as the one that led Trinity Church?
Well, the Methodists officially break with Anglicans and, as you note, Episcopalians after the Revolution, in part because of the taint that Anglicanism had. It was the Church of England, the Church of Establishment, and so there's a formal break in 1784 in which Methodists established themselves as a separate denomination. Socially, in New York, I found that there were some prominent, well-off merchants that were guiding the church from the beginning. Now, we should note that Methodist wealth was not quite the same level as Episcopalian wealth. These merchants were, we would say, closer to middling, but they were still fairly well off. And so the Methodist Church, although it had a reputation for being very much a working church, a church of the poor and dispossessed, a church for women and for slaves, also in the city at least contained a full range of social classes. And over time, specifically in the John Street congregation, which I look at in this book, one sees the well-off, the wealthier classes as the public face of the church. People like the Harper brothers of publishing fame, other individuals who are merchants, who are small-level local politicians, people who have some prominence, have some social cachet. So in that way, the Methodists aren't as radical or as populist as they might be elsewhere.
I'm curious about the racial makeup of these churches that you study, because New York City had a large black population, both enslaved blacks and free blacks, at least until, July 4th, 1827, when New York outlaws slavery. Did blacks and whites worship together in New York City during the early Republic, or did they form separate churches?
Well, one of the main thrusts of my story is the creation of separate black churches. In the late colonial era, we have record of blacks and whites worshiping together. However, the number of blacks in those churches in which there is biracial worship remain fairly small. And in part, it's probably because of the oversight that whites put on their black members. Typically, blacks, even free blacks, would be relegated to marginal positions in the church. They would have to sit in places near the back or in corners or in balconies. They were usually denied positions of formal church leadership. The Methodists would sometimes allow blacks to preach, but usually it was in an informal setting as what were called exhorters rather than as ministers. And over time, the churches continued to marginalize their black members. So consequently, what happened in the early Republic in New York and in cities throughout the United States was that members of black churches would leave the white-run churches and form their own congregations. That's the story of Mother Zion, or the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which broke from John Street. And it's the case of St. Philip's as well, which was an Episcopalian church, but one that was composed entirely of African Americans. And so the story of the early Republic is the story of the beginnings of segregation in worship. I've heard it said that some social commentators have noted that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in American life, and referring to the fact that blacks and whites often do not worship together in churches, even if they do intermingle socially elsewhere after this, in this post-civil rights era that we live in. And the origins of that go back to this early Republic time in which this segregation was voluntary and agreed to in order to allow blacks to have their own sense of leadership, their own sense of spiritual power in their own churches.
Listening to you to describe these churches and the people who worshiped in them and even where they sat, it's amazing to me how much the churches really mirror outside society. You have a highly stratified class society, and everybody's sitting in their place or governing in their place. And in the case of early America, it is in some ways very segregated. So you can see that in the churches, and I think that's very interesting. Yeah, well, one of the things that I wanted to highlight in this book was the interrelationship between the social world and the religious world. I think sometimes our contemporary situation causes us to see religion as something that is spiritual or other, maybe something that's relegated to a 1 day a week, 1 hour within that day, something along those lines. And the reality is, it was and is historically that people bring their social worlds with them into church, and in some cases bring their religious worlds out to the city streets as well. And so I think it's normal, it's to be expected that social prejudices, social assumptions, how we live with each other would also work in churches. So just to talk a little bit more about the crossover between religious life and social life, on July 4th, 1827, as we mentioned, New York State outlawed slavery. And for years, African Americans throughout the state celebrated July 4th, not just because it was American independence, but it was the date of their independence in New York. But on July 4th, 1834, Kyle discusses a massive riot that erupts in New York City. And it's a race riot. And I wonder if, Kyle, you could tell us how that joyous day, July 4th, 1834, turned into such a riotous and calamitous event, and how the four congregations you study, attempted to deal with that event and explain it.
Well, St. Philip's was most directly affected. St. Philip's Black Episcopal Church was located in the Five Points neighborhood, which was a notorious slum. There were a lot of working-class whites and blacks living in that area. And in the course of the riots, St. Philip's was dismantled. The church was just torn down. So it had to deal most directly with the after effects. Mother Zion, the African Methodist Church, was geographically a little bit outside the hot spot and avoided destruction. We don't have a lot of direct records, but it may be likely that some of the black members of that church were willing to defend the church from mobs. There's an elderly black leader of the church named William Hamilton, whose sons later recounted that their father grabbed armfuls of what they called iron missiles, willing to defend his home. We had the 60-year-old man grabbing, I don't know if it was fence posts or iron rods, willing to fight off any white gangs that would go near his house. And if that's the case, I suspect that perhaps the African Methodists were able to defend themselves a little bit better, being slightly outside the epicenter of the riots. Unfortunately, what happened in the aftermath of the riots is that the white churches distanced themselves a bit further from their black members, black co-religionists. Trinity's priest and Bishop of New York, Benjamin Onderdonk, actually forced St. Philip's priest, a man by the name of Peter Williams, to resign his position in the American Anti-Slavery Society. Onderdonk basically said, these abolitionists are radicals, they're up to no good, and so for the good of the church, you must resign your position, and Williams did so. The Trinity itself was, because had fewer black members as slavery waned, was a church largely of whites, a church that was fairly well off, and so had just less contact with blacks over time. The same could be true of John Street Methodist Church, where its early biracial mission waned as its black members went to African Methodist churches. And so we have records of men who at one point taught black classes, white men who were joined in worship with blacks, who retreated to churches that were all white. And so the aftermath of the race riots tended to further heighten a sense of social segregation. And whereby the earlier segregation, we might say, was empowering because it allowed blacks positions of leadership, this later segregation was one that heightened racial difference and just I guess we could say was really led to a sense of decline in the churches of any sort of sense of unity among races.
It's interesting how this riot, it is a race riot, but it also contains many anxieties about slavery in it. Even though slavery has been outlawed in New York for 7 or 8 years, there's still this issue of, okay, well, we freed the slaves and now what do we do? Or we might free the slaves in the South. Then what's going to happen? It's interesting to see that reflected.
Yeah, well, and St. Philip's is an interesting case too, because St. Philip's, as an Episcopal church, doesn't model what many whites expect blacks to be. St. Philip's is a church where its minister is literate. Peter Williams is very well spoken. His speeches are very elegant, the ones we have that are still published. Many of their members were well off. They'd risen up the ranks. You have blacks who were prominent merchants. They were connected to the shipping industry. Some were connected to prominent tobacco companies like the Lorillard family. Others were professionals. We have the first black doctor in the United States, James McCune Smith, who comes from St. Philip's. And the church itself promoted literacy, promoted education. It was prominent in reform movements. And so it was a church that defied racial stereotypes. And so consequently, it was one that I think caused the greatest anxiety. If free blacks can provide such a model of order, of decorum, if free blacks can achieve these things, what does that say about the slave system, which we use by justifying by saying blacks can't rule themselves, can't govern themselves? And so that anxiety, that sense of race mixing, a sense of maybe even racial passing, that blacks can become white in their behavior, really ramps up. And I think that's why St. Philip's got targeted before Mother Zion, and why it was the one that was destroyed in those riots.
Are we just talking about anxiety, or is it possible that we're also talking a little bit of jealousy? I mean, are we too early to talk about how maybe poor whites want some of the opportunities that these blacks at St. Philip's are having, the chance to learn, to read and write and better themselves? I mean, when you think of 5 Points, you think of a very poor area.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. We should probably note that those historians who have studied these mobs have said, as Leonard Richards said, these are gentlemen of property and standing. In part, that is, there's a working class component of working class whites that are probably jealous of the upward mobility of many blacks. But there are also some well-off whites that are connected to the mobs as well, and they're perhaps just as anxious or jealous of these connections. They're maybe not at the highest levels of society. Evidence indicates that they think maybe the world is passing them by. And certainly the call for abolition, the end of slavery in the South, is something that causes them a lot of fear, even though it's not affecting them directly in the North. It's something that they're worried about, that they don't want to see happen. So yeah, there's a whole complicated psychology and set of motivations that come along with the riots that we see in New York and this year and throughout northern cities throughout the decade of the 1830s.
Now, we've talked a lot about the economic rank of the congregants in these churches that you study, as well as the racial makeup. Let's talk a little bit about the gender makeup. From the studies
Sure.
that I've read, more women than men participated in church life in the early republic. Now, did women represent a majority of the congregants in the congregations you studied?
Overwhelmingly so. In the black churches, the evidence is fragmentary, but maybe upwards of 75%. In the white churches, it looks like it's about 2/3 to 3/4, which is in line with other churches in the early republic. So these are churches of women, largely so, overwhelmingly so in some cases.
And what role did women play in the congregations that you studied?
Women are numerically the backbone of the churches. They're a sort of silent majority, though. Women in the churches are typically not given positions of leadership. They are not given a voice. Subsequent histories of these churches really sort of narrate minister to minister. You go from one pastor or priest to the next and discuss buildings and vestry men, that is, the men who are at the top, who are leading the church, who are funding the church. But underneath the vitality, the belief, the passion of the church is run by women. And we see evidence of this coming through indirectly. There are sources here and there where it emerges, and we can get glimpses of it. One example in John Street Methodist is that of Catherine Livingston Garretson, who was born into the Livingston family of upstate New York, one of the wealthiest landowning families in New York. And she had the bad sense, from her family perspective, to run off and join the Methodists. One of her brothers said, "Why would you become a Methodist? There's only fishermen and Negroes that join that church," right? And she went and not only joined the Methodists, but married a Methodist minister by the name of Freeborn Garretson, who was formerly a Maryland slaveholder who also had the audacity of freeing his slaves at his conversion. So sort of renounced his planter status in the Upper South. So Garretson, Catherine Garretson and Freeborn used their social status to house Methodist ministers, though. They worshipped in John Street. They still had an upstate New York or a Rhinebeck, New York residence on the Hudson, and would use their home as a retreat for Methodist ministers. They befriended Methodists of somewhat higher social status, the merchants who were, in many cases, and their wives who were well off. They took part in Sunday school societies. So Catherine was a leader in the Sunday school movement. She was a leader in various charity movements to help ministers and their wives. And so Catherine's example is one that shows us that the women are active, even if they don't always show up in the official narrative. In many ways, they're the lifeblood of the church. They're the passion of the church. The church actually lives and breathes and moves through its women members.
Now, your study has really focused on New York City. You have these 4 congregations, and you tell a really good story. But I wonder, we think of New York as a special place, right? Today it's like the hub of America and the hub of the world. But what can your study of New York City churches tell us about the wider experience of religious life in the United States during the early republic?
Well, religion in New York, as you know, is different in part just because New York is a unique place. And so some of the story that I tell just is going to be different than it is elsewhere. It's as a middle colony, mid-Atlantic state, New York is a hub between New England and the South. It's got a different racial makeup. It has slavery a bit longer than many other northern states. Some of the specifics are different, as you note. But as a city, and as a large city, New York's churches experience religious change, in some cases faster and earlier than other places in the United States. That is, all American religious groups go through periods of change and transformation. And looking at the New York churches, though, shows that some of these transformations occur earlier and at a faster rate than elsewhere. So, for example, some of historians have noted that after an early period of popularization or democratization in American Christianity, that churches tended to move upward. There's a sense of upward mobility, a sense of gentrification. And indeed, that pull towards money, towards gentry, I find occurred in these churches, in some cases decades before other historians have suggested it elsewhere. You have what one scholar has called a feminization of American Christianity. That is, there's women's leadership or a promotion of sentimentalism in theology that accompanies reform movements. And indeed, Catherine Livingston Garretson embodies that, again, probably a couple decades before most people would think to look for it. The racial segregation and creation of separate churches, black churches, is something that happens early in New York. It happens early in other cities as well. And the promotion of black abolitionist movements also occurs earlier in the cities. So partly what this reveals to us is that when you have cities, you have a sort of critical mass of demography, of people, of classes jostling together, and so social changes that are long in the making, in many cases, can occur at a faster rate than they might otherwise. So in that case, New York's religious history, while in some ways it's different, is in other ways just part of that American story.
And when I posted that I was going to prepare questions for your interview, listener Chris asked this question, and it's not necessarily related to your book, but he wondered if maybe you could answer it for him. So Chris would like to know your thoughts about whether we should consider the American Revolution as a war of religion.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as an academic, I would offer the usual on the one hand, but on the other hand sort of response, which sometimes drives my students crazy. But on the surface of it, the American Revolution was not a war of religion in any sense. But there are good reasons to examine religious motives which are interwoven throughout some of the revolutionary tensions. As you noted earlier, the Anglican Church was seen as the established church, a church of England. And so at least in northern colonies, in northern states, there is a strong anti-Anglican prejudice that accompanies revolutionary patriot attempts at promoting liberty. In New York, for example, Anglican ministers attempted to establish King's College, the university that would eventually become Columbia, as an Anglican establishment. They wanted to make the college connected officially to the training of Anglican priests, and there was a backlash among people who would later be identified as patriots. In the northern colonies, there's an attempt to bring bishops to America, Anglican bishops, and establish the church more fully with the church hierarchy. And historian Patricia Bonamy has noted that in some cases the furor over bishops ran as hot and produced almost as much paper as the Stamp Act. That is, there are patriots who fear that, you bring in bishops, you bring in kings, right? If you support hierarchy in religion, you support hierarchy in government, and this is something that many patriots are opposed to. So there's sort of a general anti-Anglican animus, at least in the North. Now, in the South, you have many prominent Anglicans who are patriots, and because they control their local parishes, they can control who is priest and who isn't. There's not that same tension, right? George Washington is Anglican. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are Anglican, at least of a sort of a rationalist sort. They pay their ministers' salaries, and they don't have any turbulent priests that they have to deal with, and so that sort of dynamic is not as prevalent. In general, groups that are more evangelical-leaning, groups that are not connected to establishment, their rank and file, by and large, join the patriot cause. And what we can see from that is that sort of the mainline middle of American colonial religion moves in step with sort of the great mass of people, the middling sorts that largely back the revolution. It's in the minority groups that are religious minorities or racial minorities, where we see difference religiously and then also in terms of the politics. Groups that were maybe on the outs often took a more neutral stance to the revolution, or if push came to shove, might become loyalists. You see that certainly with some of the pacifistic German-speaking sects in the middle colonies. You see that to some degree with the Quakers. You see it with some of the Jewish and Roman Catholic populations. And you certainly see it with many blacks as well. So what that suggests is that religion connects to ethnicity, it connects to social status, and so when the revolution breaks down, in some cases along ethnic or class lines, religion follows as well, and so it's interwoven throughout.
Now that brings us to the time warp, and we're going to go back to New York City for that. So this is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. Are you ready for your time warp question, Kyle?
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the Anglicans and Methodists had not permitted their African-American congregants to form the Mother Zion Methodist and St. Philip's Episcopal churches? How would the lack of a predominantly black church or black churches have affected New York's policies concerning slavery, free African-Americans, and the religious life of the city?
It's a fascinating problem to consider. Scholars have long noted that the black church has been a essential social feature of the black community. That is, black ministers were often community leaders, often elected politicians. The black churches administered social welfare and poor relief. They promoted literacy and, in general, fought for political reform all the way through to the civil rights movement. Certainly seen through the person of Martin Luther King Jr., and it continues even to today with ministers like Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton, who are active in politics. If we take away the black church as a place of leadership, as a place of community, it's hard to consider or conceive what might have happened. I suspect that New York's early Republic blacks would have tended to create communities more in secret. They would not have a religious component to them, or as much of a religious component to them. And consequently, such groups would probably be more radical, more oppositional, probably more anti-religious than they were. As an example, we could look at the colonial situation in New York as a comparison. New York witnessed a couple of different, one slave uprising and one slave conspiracy in 1711 and 1741, in which blacks plotted the violent overthrow of white authorities. And that is in part because they were not allowed places to congregate, places to express themselves. So if there is no black church, if there's no separate black church and no space for black community, you don't have a space for participation in the public sphere, and so consequently race relations are much more contested, much more violent. And I'm not saying that they were necessarily good and calm, but certainly there is, in the idea of having churches, white churches and black churches, there's at least a common dialogue, a common theology of some sort that allows different groups to get together and have a basis of conversation. So in many ways, the black churches allow for a smoothing of race relations that might not otherwise have occurred.
So it could have affected everything. That certainly gives us food for thought to think about. Now, before we conclude, would you tell us about what aspect of religious history you were researching and writing about now? Yeah, well, the birth of the black church, which I covered here, requires one component, one factor that needs to happen before you can have a black church. You have to have black Christians. And scholars have noted that throughout the colonial era, there's not a lot of evidence of African-American slaves being interested in converting to Christianity, and nor were masters throughout the colonial era very interested in having them convert to Christianity. It's really very much a revolutionary or early Republic phenomenon. And so for this study, I want to go back to before the black church and figure out, how did this process of conversion start? What led blacks to look at this Protestant Christian faith as something that might be attractive to them? Well, good luck to you as you investigate that story. Now, for those of us who would like to learn more about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you, where should we look for that information? The best place is the Utah State University History Department website. So
anyone interested could go to history.usu.edu to look up any further contact information. My book is available on Amazon, and New York University Press also maintains a website with more information about my publication there.
Fantastic. And we'll include links to the NYU Press website and the Utah State website for you in the show notes page for this episode. Well, Kyle, thank you for taking us into the world of early American religious history in New York City, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Liz. I greatly appreciate it.
Religion played a large role in the way early Americans lived their lives. Religion not only caused many Europeans to settle in British North America, it guided and reflected their non-religious social, cultural, and economic lives. Even today, we can see the effects of early American religious traditions in our present-day society. As Kyle pointed out, Black Americans and white Americans largely worship in separate churches, even when they adhere to the same faith today. You can find more information about Kyle, his book, 4 Steeples Over the City Streets, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, which you'll find at benfranklinsworld.com/020. Would you like to ask one of our guest historians a question? If so, you should join Poor Richard's Club, our private social community for Ben Franklin's World listeners, or follow the BF World hashtag on Twitter. Each time I sit down to prepare an interview, I post to these outlets to inquire whether you have questions for a particular guest and on a historical topic. I know Twitter can be a bit tricky, so stay tuned to the BF World hashtag on Thursday evenings about 8 p.m. Eastern, which is usually when I sit down to prepare my questions. And finally, if you could ask any person from the past a question, who would you talk to and what would you ask? Please share your answers with me by sending an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com or tweeting me at Liz Covart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.